Hello, everyone. Shane Lynn at MacArthur Museum of Arkansas Military History, and I'm joined by David Sesser today. David is the Director of Museum Studies and Collections, librarian at Henderson State University down in Arkadelphia, Arkansas. Recently, he received the Walter L. Brown Award for Best Edited Document Award in a county or local journal from the Arkansas Historical Association for his manuscript, We Saw a Beautiful Town, Union Soldiers' Impressions of Arkadelphia during the Camden Expedition. The article appeared in the 2020 Clark County Historical Journal. But he's also the author of Little Rock Arsenal Crisis, and that's why we're going to be talking with him today. I wanted to have him on and talk to him about the crisis. He actually, as we said before, wrote the book. And so, David, thank you for being with us and joining us today.
I'm very glad to be here.
Well, you know, this is the topic of the Arsenal crisis is a major focus we have here at the museum, since we are the site of where this occurred. The building we're in, the museum is 181 years old. Of course, it was built as an arsenal for the United States Army in 1840. And we like to tell folks as a teaser that the first shots of the Civil War were almost fired right here at the arsenal in early February of 1861. So I was going to let you take it from there. How did the first shots of the Civil War almost start right here in Little Rock, Arkansas?
Well, it's a long and detailed story, so I'll just start at the beginning. The Arsenal crisis was a collision of a number of factors that came together to create the perfect situation. Events occurring on a national scale, and then events followed in response in Arkansas. So on the national level, of course, you have the election of Abraham Lincoln in November of 1860. Between his election and his inauguration in March of 1861, secessionists throughout the South had months and months to stoke fears about how Lincoln would negatively impact the white ruling class in that part of the country. And that led directly to the secession of most of the states in the Deep South by the time of the crisis in February of 61. So South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had all left the Union by February the 1st. Now, it's important to remember that these states, slavery was a huge part of their economy, if not the main driver of their economy. South Carolina was more than 57% of its population was enslaved in 1860. Of the states that had seceded, Texas had the lowest percentage of its population enslaved at 30.2. In Arkansas, 25.5% of our population was enslaved in 1860. So in Arkansas, you have a different situation. In the southern and eastern parts of the state, you have people who are beginning to push for secession because their economies are more closely tied to large-scale agriculture. In the central, northern, and western parts of the state, you don't have that push quite yet. So while we have these big national conversations going on, a similar conversation is happening in Arkansas because we also just elected a new governor. Henry Massey Rector was elected in 1860. He was a member of the family, as we like to call it. So it was a bunch of intermarried, interrelated people, a lot of them originally from Kentucky, who came to Arkansas and basically held control of the state politics from territorial days up until the Civil War. His father was a deputy surveyor of the Missouri and Arkansas territories, but he died when Henry was young. But before he died, one of the things he did was he was able to acquire title to prime tracts of land, especially in the Ouachita Mountains. And in fact, Elias Rector held the title to what is basically now Hot Springs, Arkansas, including the land where all of the springs are located. Henry Rector grew up in Kentucky, moved to Arkansas at age 19 to make his fortune. And he basically bounced from thing to thing, trying to make his mark in the state. He was related to various politicians, but he never really was successful. His best thing he did in 1859, he obtained a seat on the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, but he was removed in less than a year because he basically didn't know what he was talking about in his opinions. Kind of in response to that, he decided to run for governor. He ran as a Democrat against another Democratic candidate that was sponsored by the family. That was Richard Mentor Johnson, whose brother was Robert Johnson, a U.S. Senator from Arkansas at the time. Rector, running as an independent Democrat, didn't really have a platform. He did campaign better than his opponent Johnson, but that was about it. He had no platform. He at first said, yes, we need to create a system of public schools in the state. But then when it was pointed out, you have to tax people for that, he decided, no, we can't do that. We need to cut taxes instead. It was a very confusing situation, but in the end, Rector ends up winning with 52% of the vote. So he takes office in November of 1860. And he has, he's in office, and the state General Assembly is meeting in Little Rock in early 1861, late 1860, early 1861. He needs an issue to latch onto to really bring popular support behind him, because even though he won the governorship, most of the members of the legislature are either members of the family or they're allied with the family. So he decides secession is that issue that he's going to push. He asked the General Assembly to call for a secession conference. Eventually, in early 1861, the state Senate passes a bill, and the bill that was eventually passed calls for a vote to be held on February 18th, 1861, where people will go to the polls and they'll vote on two things: whether or not to hold a secession convention, and then if a secession convention is held, who will represent them. So while all these things are going on the national scale, President James Buchanan is still in office. And the War Department decides that there needs to be some troops at these posts in the South where these talks of secession are going on. So on December 6th, 1860, a battery of artillery from the 2nd United States Artillery arrived in Little Rock from Fort Smith. They came down the Arkansas River and arrived in December, unloaded, and marched through the streets of Little Rock to the arsenal. Before that time, the arsenal was basically unstaffed. There were a few caretakers around, but there were no real military soldiers there at the post on a regular basis. The captain of the battery was James Todden, whose father was a prominent physician in Little Rock at that time. So he actually arrived before his men and spent the holiday season having a good time in Little Rock. Pretty soon after they arrived on January 28th, Rector, still needing this secession issue to build support behind himself, wrote Todden. In that letter, he claimed that the federal troops could remain at the arsenal until the citizens of the state decided to leave the Union. He also demanded that the weapons and munitions at the arsenal remain in place and they should not be moved or destroyed. And he closed the letter by demanding that Todden publicly agree to these terms in an effort to quiet any rumors that the weapons would be used against the citizens of Arkansas. So with that first letter, and that's important to remember, we have copies of all of these letters that go back and forth. Everything that was written down is a great way to trace all of these events. Rector successfully tied the ongoing national conversation about secession to now what is going on in Arkansas. but it's a situation that he himself created. Totten responded much more nicely than most people probably would have, pointed out that he was an officer in the United States Army, he would follow his oath, and he reported to superiors in Washington, D.C., not Little Rock. At the same time, Totten knew that the situation could easily escalate out of control, so he immediately started telegraphing his superiors in Washington. And this is where the telegraph comes into play. It's very important in the story. Right as the crisis began to heat up, Little Rock was connected directly by a telegraph line through Des Arc to Memphis. In honor of that new telegraph line, all of the towns in Arkansas that were already connected to Memphis and other places east of the Mississippi River, they were able to listen in to the first messages that were sent from Little Rock. So one of the first messages included a rumor that federal troops were on their way to reinforce the arsenal, and additional troops were also on their way to Fort Smith. So in response to that, a group of citizens in Helena sent Rector a message and asked permission to seize the arsenal before these reinforcements could arrive. Now, Rector knows that he's on shaky ground here. He very carefully composed a reply, writing in part that while he did not have the authority to call for troops, if they did arrive, he would interpose his official position on their behalf. In sending this reply, he allowed for troops to arrive in the city without him personally taking responsibility for calling them. So that led to a flood of armed civilians arriving from Phillips, Jefferson, Prairie, Monroe, White, St. Francis, Saline, Hot Spring, and Montgomery counties. Now, if you look at all those counties, almost all of those locales were dependent on slave labor for their economic prosperity, with the two notable exceptions being Hot Spring and Montgomery counties. And let's be clear, these are not soldiers. They might be members of a militia company, but they are really armed civilians. And it's important to note that they are armed. The first ones began to arrive in Little Rock early on the morning of February the 5th, and the citizens of Little Rock woke up and there are armed men on the streets. The next day, Rector wrote Totten again, and he basically demanded the surrender of the arsenal. In this note, he claimed that his duty as governor was to prevent a collision between the people of the state and the federal troops. He continued saying that the surrender of the arsenal was the only thing that could prevent the effusion of blood and the destruction of property of the citizens and the government. In the meantime, Totten continued to write his superiors in D.C. He never, ever received a reply. Turns out that he likely didn't receive a reply because he was corresponding with Colonel Samuel Cooper, the Adjutant General of the United States Army, who on March 7th resigned his commission and instead joined the Confederate Army. Samuel Cooper actually was the highest ranking Confederate general in the entire Army because he reached the rank of full general before anyone else. And he served the whole war basically as Adjutant General of the Confederate Army. People in Little Rock are obviously on edge. So the Little Rock City Council calls out the Capitol Guards, which is the local militia unit that saw service in the Mexican-American War. There's a lot of social and economic differences between the people of Little Rock and the members of the Capitol Guards, especially, and these armed civilians that are arriving in the city. There's some bad blood that dates back to the Mexican-American War, in fact. So the civilians are actually at what is now the old State House on Markham Street. And the Capitol Guards come out, and instead of protecting the arsenal, what they do is they surround the old State House to prevent these people from leaving. And that kind of made the situation even more tense. A mass meeting was held near the State House on February the 6th by a delegation of Little Rock citizens, who then went to Rector and said, "You have got to take control of these armed people." He agreed to do so, now that he had some semblance of a request from the people of Little Rock. And he actually appointed former Governor John Roan in charge of these armed men. By taking control of the armed citizens, Rector finally had the army he desired. The Capitol Guards no longer had the authority to keep them at the old State House. By the next day, Totten realized that the situation was out of control and he could not stop it. So he asked Rector for terms of surrender. The eventual agreement allowed the federal troops to depart the post with all the equipment that they brought with them from Fort Smith, as well as their personal property. Totten made clear that he was only turning the arsenal over to Rector to prevent violence, and that he was giving it to the state to be held in trust until the current political situation had become settled. So the federal troops, with some of these volunteer civilian officers, completed an inventory of everything in the arsenal. And the federal troops marched out of the arsenal on February 8th, escorted by the Capitol Guards, and they marched to Fletcher's Landing. And they waited there for several days until a boat picked them up and took them to St. Louis. So with that, the arsenal crisis actually kind of came to an anticlimactic end, but the whole city was on edge for days, and it could have been much, much worse.
Yes, and as we mentioned earlier, something that's different from our today is Mr. Lincoln was not going to take office until March the 4th, as set forth by the Constitution. Presidents didn't take office until then, and then that changed with FDR, his second term, to what we're accustomed to now is January 20th. So people sometimes get that confused. Well, why wasn't Lincoln, president yet? Even though he was elected in November, it would be the 4th of March before he would actually take office. So a lot of the, as you said, those states had seceded even before he took office. And Arkansas sort of took a wait and see attitude, the citizens, right? They didn't immediately join the Confederacy right away.
Right. Yeah. We really took our time in Arkansas. I mean, it took the calling of the secession convention. Eventually, that occurred. The convention met, and they decided not to take any action, but rather refer that back to the voters to have a popular referendum. Of course, the national situation continued to deteriorate, and after the firing on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln asked Arkansas to provide volunteers to help suppress the rebellion, and that is when the convention met again and voted almost unanimously to leave the Union. But thankfully, Isaac Murphy held his ground and voted to remain in the Union. So that was well after all of the surrounding states left. I'm sorry, the exception of Tennessee. Tennessee was also pretty late. It was actually, one of the first states to rejoin the Union as well.
Yes, and Governor Rector, he keeps those terms, right? Because he does take over the arsenal, but he doesn't distribute the weapons to that militia group, correct?
Right. Yes.
Keeps them home.
They took the weapons. They kept them in trust. When units began to organize in the state, those weapons were issued to Arkansas units. So parts of the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th Arkansas Infantry Regiments, as well as the 3rd Arkansas Cavalry, received weapons from the arsenal.
But that was after the Arkansas had seceded, correct?
Yes, that was after Arkansas had seceded. Mm-hmm.
So I guess you could say, to Rector's credit, he did keep his word to Captain Totten that he didn't give the weapons away until Arkansas did officially secede. Yeah,
we can definitely give him credit for that.
And could you talk to the citizens of Little Rock? Were very grateful to Captain Totten. They actually saw him as someone who kept the peace and prevented this bloodshed. And they were so thankful they gave him something.
Yeah, so Little Rock could have taken the title of city where the Civil War began away from Charleston, but I mean, a huge part of the credit is due to Totten. And in response to this, a group of 107 women from the city gave him a sword that was inscribed, to Captain James Totten from the Ladies of Little Rock. And then on the other side, when woman suffers, chivalry forbears. The soldier fears all danger but his own. So that's a very nice inscription. But what's even more striking is the note that came with it, which read, "Accept this tribute of our respect and gratitude. Wear it in defense of your country, but sooner let it rust in your scabbard than draw it in the cause of injustice or oppression." So Totten responded. He was very grateful. He accepted the sword. He said that it shall be borne in the defense of my country, always when right, and never in any land or against any people on the side of wrong, injustice, oppression, or their constitutional rights. Well, we know that Totten remained in the Union Army. He served in the Union Army throughout the Civil War, almost exclusively in the Trans-Mississippi. And he participated in the first large-scale battle in the Trans-Mississippi, Wilson's Creek, in August 1861, where his battery engaged what was then called the Pulaski Light Artillery, but before that had actually been an artillery unit named in his honor, the Totten Light Artillery. Fire from his guns likely, but we can't say positively, but likely killed some members of the unit, including Second Lieutenant Omer Weaver. So after that, people changed their minds about Totten and how he responded to the Arsenal crisis and everything. But I always like to point out that by defending the Union, he was in fact following his oath. He was doing exactly what he said he would do, because he felt that the secessionists were wrong, and he gave an oath to the United States.
And
so
the ladies weren't too happy with him, right? In fact, didn't one of them write a letter to him demanding the sword, he return the sword back?
Yes, and as far as we know, he either ignored it, didn't receive it. He didn't express himself about that.
Right. So. Well, after Totten leaves and the Arsenal begins its caretaker phase before the secession, what happens to Little Rock? Does the city fall back into a calm after this?
Yeah, at least for the time being, life returned to normal for the citizens of Little Rock. Those volunteer groups returned home mostly, and there was some activity with shipments of arms up and down the Arkansas River. Eventually, some groups went up to Fort Smith to capture the fort there. They actually left from Little Rock. That was very anticlimactic as well, because the post had been evacuated already. But little happened until at the Arsenal, really, until the fall of Little Rock in September of 1863. Of course, Confederate forces held the Arsenal up until then. They took control of it in May of 1861, and they used it as an arsenal, as a military post. And federal troops, once they came into the city, they once again used it as a military post. And that is where David O'Dowd was tried, and he was hanged, not at the Arsenal, but next door at St. John's College, which is now roughly underneath I-30. And then, of course, you know, the city of Little Rock grew immensely after the war. And then 1892, the land swap occurred where the city gained the Arsenal and the surrounding grounds, and gave the Army 1,100 acres on the north bank of the Arkansas River, where they built Fort Logan H. Roots.
Right. Well, you've done obviously a lot of research on this, and you've written a book, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But what, in your opinion, what do you believe is the historical significance of this arsenal crisis that occurred? Maybe to Arkansas history, obviously, but maybe in the national picture as well.
Well, especially in Arkansas history, it shows just how divided the state was. We have letters from the two sitting U.S. senators to Rector telling him in the middle of this situation, stop what you're doing. The situation does not exist in Arkansas. You're creating this. You have other people, you have especially the citizens of Little Rock who, at least at this time, probably don't support secession. A majority of them don't. And they don't want to see bloodshed in their streets. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have firebrands like Thomas C. Heineman and other very pro-secessionist people, especially from Eastern Arkansas, pushing. We've got to do this. We've got to do it now. And it really shows how divided a state Arkansas was. On the national scale, there were facilities seized in Florida, Texas, of course, most notably South Carolina with the firing on Fort Sumter. What I can say is this wasn't a great situation that occurred in Arkansas, but at least we can say eventually cooler heads prevailed, and we were able to avoid having that notoriety of having the war begin in our state.
Right, and something that I always I looked at, and I actually, after I read the story and learn what happened, I feel bad for Totten in the sense that here's an officer in the United States Army. He's writing, telegraphing his superiors, giving them the situation, needing to know what to do. And as you said, the Buchanan administration, the War Department, they just didn't respond to him. He had to feel like he was abandoned. And he had to basically he was on his own to make the decisions that he made.
Yeah, definitely. And we have to remember, he had been in the Army for quite a while by that point, but he was still just a captain, which is a pretty low-ranking officer. And he had no support whatsoever. He's making these decisions. He has two lieutenants with him at the post, one of whom had already resigned his commission and was going to join the Confederate Army, but his resignation had not yet been accepted. So that's why he was still there. So he really doesn't have anyone underneath him that he can work with. And so he is really alone. And it's amazing that he was able to prevent the violence. I mean, almost all of the credit for avoiding the violence needs to go to Captain Todd.
Right. And it's a story, as you said, that has state, obviously interest and implications, but in the national, because it sort of shows you because the military at that time was not very large. The peacetime army, I think it was only like 23,000 actual U.S. Army troops, and that included officers and enlisted. And so these rumors that that more troops were coming to Arkansas was obviously not true, because quite frankly, the military didn't have those troops to send.
Right, so, exactly.
Arkansas. And of course, when the war, that's why Lincoln had to call for volunteers after the war, the war started. Now, how did you get interested in this? So, the book is wonderful. It's called The Little Rock Arsenal that you wrote. We sell it here in our museum, in our gift shop. It's also, you can get it from various, online places too. But have you always been interested? And how did the Little Rock crisis come to be?
Well, I've always been interested in the Civil War. I grew up in Natchez, Mississippi, and that whole town is steeped in the history of the antebellum South. And I came to Henderson and took a class, Civil War and Reconstruction, with Dr. Angela Boswell, and wrote some papers in there. And it really just grew from there. I wrote my first master's thesis on Confederate Major General T.J. Churchill, who later became governor of Arkansas, and how I specifically became interested in the Arsenal crisis. One thing about, almost 20 years ago now, we reenacted the trial of David O'Dodd in the Arsenal, and it was recorded, and I portrayed David O'Dodd in that reenactment. And also, I began writing things for the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. And one of the things I wrote about was the Arsenal crisis. And a publisher contacted me out of the blue and said they thought it would make a good book. Would I be interested? And I said yes, and it just went from there. So it kind of like the Arsenal crisis, a whole bunch of things going right all at the same time, when that was a whole bunch of things going wrong at the same time.
Well, it certainly is a well-written book, and I always refer it to people who want to know more about an in-depth understanding of the Arsenal crisis. And of course, it's the first book I read when I came to work here 5 years ago, and it's very good. And I had a chance to meet you at a couple of conferences, and I knew when we started to do these virtual interviews, I knew I wanted at some point to do one on the Arsenal crisis, because it's such a large part of the story that we tell here at the museum. Any other, I mentioned your article that you had, that you actually received the Walter L. Brown Award for, which is, the Camden Expedition has a tie to to our site as well, since it left from here and came back here. Do you have any other articles or books you may be working on, or anything you want to tell us about?
Well, I'm actually working on a book on the Camden Expedition. I'm trying to do a complete in-depth analysis of the entire campaign, and then at the same time explore how the expedition has been remembered and interpreted, especially at the actual battlefield sites in southern Arkansas. One of the things that stands out to me is how we can trace the evolution of the interpretation of these sites by simply looking at the monuments that have been placed there over time. And so I'm working with some of my museum studies students, and we are exploring the history of the parks, and we're going to incorporate that. And then the second project I'm working on it's more long-term. I'm working on a history of Henderson State University. I've written 2 book-length examinations of the university for different things, but this is going to specifically focus on the period from 1929, when we became a state-supported institution, to roughly 2020. And I hope to have that put together for the centennial of us becoming a state institution in 2029. So yeah, those are my 2 big projects, and then lots of little things always going on.
Well, I hope that you will put us on your calendar when your book on the Camden Expedition comes out, because I want to have a book signing here. We'd love to have you here and talk about that, because that's something I'm very interested in and looking forward to. So thank you for doing this interview. Thank you for writing this book and helping keep Arkansas history and Civil War history alive, and all that you do.
All right. Well, I sure appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Well, have a good day.
All right. You too.